Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Welcome to News Laundry, where we bring you for free, with more than ample warning, on this dreary daily morning, we, the men on a mission at erstwhile Planning Commission, a chat with the blue-eyed boy, also known as Bibek Debroy. Bibek, welcome to News Laundry. I think the man needs no introduction, but in any case, he is fantastic personality on and off Twitter. He is the chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He is one of the most erudite and intellectual personalities when it comes to writing away from economics, which is his core domain. But today we're going to be talking about this new book that he has co-authored with Kishore Arun Desai, who also joins us. Welcome, Kishore. Kishore was at GE, and then he left GE and is an OSD, which is Officer on Special Duty at Niti Aayog. And both of them have co-authored this book called On the Trail of the Black. This is regarding, and it has a subheading called Tackling Corruption. So I have a few questions for Bibek as well as for Kishore, and at the end we will have a few questions that Tweeples have been asking you in Limerick. So let's see how that goes. So welcome to News Laundry, gentlemen. Bibek, I'd like to start with just one simple question, which is, this book, you had in mind to always write it, or did demonetization bring about this fact that you like to write something on this topic?
Thank you for organizing this interview. Rare is the chance that one gets to correct you. Right. Having got the opportunity, this is not exactly co-authored by us. Okay. It is co-edited by us. There's a collection of papers written by various people.
Right.
The thought about this book was actually triggered by the events of 8th November last year. It's not that I have been uninterested in corruption earlier. There is a book that Lavish Bhandari and I had authored some years ago called The DNA and RNA of Corruption. What started us thinking was that a lot of the debate tended to focus on that single incident that transpired on the 8th of November. But in our minds, this was part of a broader attempt to cleanse the system. And that had started before 8th of November and would continue after 8th of November. So this book may have been triggered by the events of 8th of November, but what it sets out to do is to present the broader landscape. And indeed, when we spoke to the publisher, when you ask people to write papers, they need some amount of time. And when we spoke to the publishers, in this particular case, Rupa wanted to launch it, so to speak, exactly 1 year after 8th of November.
Right. Okay. So that's right. And the book is dedicated, it says, dedicated to Narendra Modi, Honorable Prime Minister of India, and the Architect of Change. So here I'd like to ask you, Bibek, when we see what has transpired in the last 3 years, it's quite obvious that the Prime Minister, at least to me, has not held true to many of the promises that he made before 2014. The principle among them was maximum governance, minimum government, and the government has no business to be in business. What kind of change has he brought about when you say he's the architect of change? Because we still see no disinvestment per se to talk of. We still have Air India, although, I don't know for how long, because you are, I suppose you are the real architect of change who wants to, kind of privatize Air India. We still have hotels like Ashok Hotel and ITDC and things of that sort. So when you say architect of change, what has he changed?
There are two levels at which I can answer this question. This dedication and architect of change was in the specific context of this book and the institutional cleansing up that the Prime Minister has sought to bring about in addressing the issue of corruption and black money. But you are asking a broader question.
Right.
So let me respond to the broader question. There are certain obvious things that one has to realize and accept. Unfortunately, people don't accept that. This is a government that is a union government. There are state governments, and depending on the year, 90 to 95% of national income originates in states. There is parliament, there is judiciary, and therefore any expectations of maximum government and maximum governance and minimum government must be interpreted in that particular context. Let's take the issues you have mentioned item by item. Something that the Prime Minister has often talked about, the elimination of old dysfunctional statutes. There is a long list of that. About 1,200 have been repealed. Moving away from statutes, there has been a lot that is in the nature of simplification. Whether it is through DIPP and the doing business kind of indicators or through Ministry of Commerce, simplification of administrative rules. There are instances like self-declaration which have been accepted. That also is minimum government. There have been instances where interviews have been scrapped. Government procurement, which used to be a hotbed of corruption, has moved to a portal now. So item by item, there has actually been less of government and less intrusive government. But this is a process. You mentioned disinvestment. Quite often people don't realize that when I am talking about, and at the moment I'm using the words disinvestment and privatization synonymously, although the two should be distinct. The most valuable asset that a public sector enterprise possesses generally tends to be land. So before taking a decision to disinvest, I need an inventory about the land that exists. My friends are constantly surprised when I tell them that until recently, there was no such inventory of land with central public sector enterprises. It is only with this particular government that we have that inventory. Without that inventory, the question of large-scale disinvestment, which borders on privatization, does not even arise. And most of the earlier instances of controversy about privatization have been issues over land. So far as this year's target, fiscal target for disinvestment is concerned, as you well know, that target is likely to be exceeded. Air India is on the cards. So it is not quite true, and one must also state the obvious, that when one reacts to minimum government, most of the time people like you and I and even Kishore, we have a very metro-urban kind of focus.
Yes.
There are areas where government has not existed, which means that there are parts of India where you need the public transport, you need the roads, the railways, the electricity.
Health.
Health. So in those areas you actually need more government within quotes.
Yeah, but to come back to this aspect of the disinvestment that you're saying the targets are going to be exceeded, but isn't it true that if, for example, the government disinvests in its own company, public sector company, for example, Coal India, it forces another public sector company to buy shares in it, which is what LIC did. So would you really call it disinvestment, or was it like shifting the family silver from one cupboard to another?
This I'm not going to quibble about, but that's the reason I said that first you need an inventory of the land.
Yeah.
And again, people often have the impression that this land is all owned by the union government.
Right.
More often than not, it is not. Even if it is a central PSC, the land is actually owned by a state government. It is on lease with the union government. So it has to be returned to the state government. So therefore, there are certain processes that need to be gone through, including judicial processes, because quite often sometimes there are central PSCs which are stuck in litigation, sometimes because of land issues, sometimes because of labor issues. So all I'm saying is there are complexities.
But did not the Prime Minister himself buckle under the opposition pressure, or whatever you may call it, during the Land Acquisition Act? I mean, that was one solid reform, and you had written about it, and everyone was rooting for it. And then suddenly one fine day we find he said, okay, I'm not going to take this further anymore.
Let's take this land.
Wouldn't that have been a real thrust as far as the land,
But let's take that Land Act, 2013. There's a 7th schedule to the Constitution, which has a union list, which has a concurrent list, and which is a state list. Land is squarely in the state list. The way the UPA government brought it in was what I think was an incorrect interpretation of the spirit, if not the law of the Constitution, by the property clause. But land otherwise is squarely on the state government list. Today, it is not enough to just ask why this government did not amend it. It is also important to ask that why weren't we protesting when the union government legislated on in an area that is squarely a state subject. Having said that, to get it pushed through, you need the support of the state governments.
Sure.
You would be correct in suggesting that the PM was misled by several state chief ministers who promised their support but later backtracked. So the fault in this case, I would say, is that the Prime Minister trusting some of those chief ministers, and I guess the model to be deduced is that you should not be trusting Congress chief ministers to the extent it's a rare species now, but to the extent it exists, you should not be trusting them. That's really the model you deduce from this.
Right. Let's bring Kishore into the conversation, and I'm particularly interested because Kishore has worked in a private sector company where I suppose probably not every day, but every week, you guys are cursing the whole system, the government system and all that. How do you find coming to the government? And I want you to be ruthlessly frank, no matter that you're sitting with Professor Debroy. Just say what comes in your mind. I mean, it's obvious. Do you think a lot has changed in the government when you're now in it, I mean, quote unquote, as opposed to when you were out and, criticizing the government?
Thank you for inviting me, Anand, first of all. All throughout, I mean, I have had an experience of about 12 years in the private sector. So technically, I have always been a private sector person before joining the government.
And sorry to interrupt you, this was GE.
Not all my 12 years with
Right.
GE. So I had about 10 years of experience in consulting in different companies. But when I was a consultant, I used to advise primarily the government clients because I worked for infrastructure sector, and within the transport sector, government is the largest player, so to say. So more often than not, our clients were from the government sector. Then I was with GE for about a year, but think about it from the perspective of a person like me. If you are not a UPSC candidate, if you, for whatever reason, if you have not cleared UPSC, then there was no opportunity for people like us who are professionals, who are, so to say, sector experts to service, to enter government in the first place, and having entered government to work in hardcore policy, public policy space.
Now, this is what I want to ask. Sorry to interrupt, because the experience I have had of talking with people who are in the private sector, consultants like you working this thing, that the last thing they want to do is to come and be a part of the government. I mean, you worked in GE, which is, as you know, Six Sigma, which is one mistake in a million is tolerated. I mean, I don't know, how many mistakes in a million this government of India does. So that is what I'm interested in eking out from you, which is...
So Anand, see, I don't know. I think it really depends on the kind of on the people that you're talking to. For example, see, you have aspirations and you have certain goals, and what you do as part of your day-to-day job needs to give you that kind of a kick, that kind of a satisfaction in the first place. With government, I think one thing that I can say very confidently is the canvas of the possibility of bringing change and the width and the depth of that opportunity increases immensely. So when you are in a private sector company, say for example GE, you will have a limited sector to focus on, you will have a limited day-to-day activity, so to say, and your focus will be mainly on to get more business, because that's your KPI for all evaluation purposes.
Sorry, what's KPI?
KPI is essentially key performance indicator. So basically you will have certain targets. So basically in all the private companies you will have targets in the form of numbers. But within government, the overall, so for example when I joined, I worked on with Dr. Bibek Debroy, whether it's time to merge railway budget, whether it's time to sort of dispense with the practice of having a separate railway budget.
And this year there wasn't any railway budget.
Yeah, so that recommendation was accepted. So having made that kind of a contribution gives you that kind of a satisfaction that whatever you are doing, so writing a note, for example, just suggesting that railway budget should be dispensed with is not an easy task. One needs to get into the nitty-gritties. One needs to really explain the clear rationale, because your note is not your note. It is the note of a government.
So here's the $1 million question. Would you like to go back to private sector?
Honestly, see, I have a limited tenure in the government. If I were given a choice, I won't go back to the private sector.
All right.
And the reason is, the kind of topics that you get opportunity to work on. So, for example, I worked on railway budget, then changing financial year, then conducting simultaneous elections. These days, I have got an opportunity to work for the Economic Advisory Council to the PM. So there are a variety of topics that I am getting opportunity to work on, which otherwise I would not have worked on ever.
And how is criticism taken in private sector vis-a-vis the public sector? Do you have more freedom to criticize policies when you're in the government?
See, I think there is a sort of maturity that has come into me when I am working for the government, because then when you are not part of the government, it is very easy for everybody to criticize.
Yes.
Let me give you an example. When you go to a marketplace and you see a lot of, so I was having some golgappas in a market, and you see people eating their golgappas and just throwing away that plate. Come to that place and you'll see kitni gandagi phaili hui hai charo taraf. Why doesn't government do anything about it? It is easy as a private person to say, why doesn't the government ensure that the markets are clean, public places are clean? But when you are in the government, you realize that there is, government cannot be everywhere. You cannot expect a government official to sort of, put a dustbin baggage and ensure that anybody who is throwing garbage, who is throwing bottles, needs to put that in dustbin. So, that kind of maturity needs to be there, that clear expectation as to what is in the hands of government, what governments can do, and there are certain things that the private sector also needs to do. Comes when you are part of the setup.
Interesting.
So I think that thing is there.
Thank you. Coming back to the book, and specifically as really struck by this data that you bring out in the book, which is you tabulate the scams that have happened, excuse me, from 2010, and the total value, so Commonwealth Games, food grains in Uttar Pradesh, coal scam, 2G spectrum, Belekeri port in Karnataka. Incidentally, I wasn't really aware of this scam, which is 60,000 crore scam. Okay, what was this about, very briefly? The Belekeri port in Karnataka?
Those, do you want to?
Okay, 2010.
So I think so. The data has been picked up from the
DNA and the RNA.
So the DNA book. I think it was about the mining scam which was there in Karnataka.
Right. So it totals to about 6,58,645 crore rupees, which is phenomenal. But what is more striking is the next table that you have, Professor, where you say you talk about the 2016-17 budget components, and for health is 41,000 crores, for education 72,000 crores, food subsidy 135, total 2,48,000 crores. So just one simple question. These two tables are what, according to me, sums up the way India is working. Why this apathy? Why aren't more people able to look at this and see, look guys, we're doing something wrong here?
All right, so let me respond to it at a slightly different level, and I'll link the two. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of corruption. The first kind of corruption is the big ticket kind of corruption, the scams which we read about in the newspapers. The second kind of corruption is the petty kind of corruption that we confront in our day-to-day lives. the system begins to change, not when governments change them, but when citizens, this echoes what Kishore said in a slightly different context, when citizens begin to exert the pressure. If you look at the petty kind of corruption, and the best surveys that we have are not the Transparency International ones, but the ones that are done by the Center for Media Studies, CMS, which tracks the petty kind of corruption on public services. If you look at what CMS finds, you will see that over a period of time, the petty kinds of corruption have definitely come down. It may have come down more in urban areas, less in rural areas, and in large measure, I think this is because of the countervailing pressure, which is why there's one paper in the book which is just about that citizen kind of thing.
Yes, yes. So with increasing computerization and
all of that, the IT, plus the pressure brought by citizens, groups, RTI, all kinds of things. The big ticket kind of corruption, I think, is a more complicated issue. By the way, I should preface that by saying that whether it is black or corruption has to be defined with respect to a piece of law.
Correct.
And it's not devoid of legislation. And today the definition of corruption, or more accurately the definition of criminal misconduct, is as per the Prevention of Corruption Act, which only covers public corruption by public servants. It does not cover anything else.
So by that, sorry to interrupt, what you mean is that if a law doesn't really promote corruption, but a law kind of turns away from what you perceive is corruption, then it will not be taken as corruption.
It will not be taken as corruption.
Like, for example, Kapil Sibbal's zero loss or notional.
Let us not give undue importance to Kapil Sibal at the moment.
Right. No, what I meant was, you see here,
I
you mentioned 2G spectrum, 176, and so according to him, this figure should not be included in this table. That's what I mean.
Now, I have two broad philosophical points to make, and they are both, I think, important points. The first point I want to make is that if it is petty kinds of corruption, they are easier to address. Why? Because you eliminate the shortage, you remove the discretion, you bring in IT, allow competition, those kinds of things, remove discretion. These kinds of the big ticket kind of corruptions are in areas where you will never be able to completely eliminate discretion. It will always be there when I allocate a scarce resource. And all of these scams are actually about a scarce resource, land included. The question is, therefore, I cannot impart complete transparency and objectivity. There will always be some subjectivity. So this is a philosophical point we must appreciate, because quite often the general citizen discourse on corruption is about eliminate discretion. Yes. But we need to recognize that we will never be able to eliminate subjectivity and impart complete transparency into those big ticket decisions. There is an issue of land titles, the kinds of rules that we have for conversion, all of that. The second point I want to make is that we cannot get away from making the criminal justice system more efficient and to deliver justice on time, because some of these instances are instances where the criminal justice system for various reasons does not deliver, and corruption of the criminal kind gets into that criminal justice system. So that also we need to recognize, and part of the
does not deliver or is too time consuming, or it's still in the process?
Well, it's both, because today the system is such that it does not protect the bona fide decision and does not punish the mala fide. But on a question like corruption, I cannot suddenly expect that corruption cases will be speeded up, while simultaneously a case involving a murder is dragging on for 30 years.
Now, this is what I want to show to our readers, is just an example of what this is, a flow chart in this book, the process of handling corrupt cases. So this is quite interesting, because it just tells you the kind of almost like a river that is, with a lot of banks and things of that sort. So from filing of complaint before the CVC to appeal to the Supreme Court, there are at least I think, 20 arrows and, the flow chart. How can this be simplified?
As I said, it can only be simplified if we simplify and streamline the overall criminal justice system. Moving away from this, let me give you a figure that is often cited, which is that the conviction rate in India, across all criminal cases, not just corruption, is around 6%. But that's a misleading figure. It depends on how you count a case. This is on the basis of case being counted from the time the FIR is filed. There's a tremendous difference between a FIR being filed and a charge sheet actually being filed. If I look at the charge sheet being filed, the conviction rate is upwards of 35%.
Right.
It's around 40%. It's not that bad. So the problem is the FIR to the charge sheet, which therefore highlights not just the judiciary problems, and of course problems with the laws, the Indian Evidence Act, the Criminal Procedure Code, lawyers, all of that, but also problems with the police. And the absence, despite Supreme Court judgments, of police reforms on any significant scale.
Yes.
So to cleanse the system, you need that bit to happen.
Yes, 3 or 4 things need to happen simultaneously.
Yes.
Yes. Coming back to the real question of black money, now all of us know, in fact, his statement has been incredibly misinterpreted as well, Prime Minister's statement. So could you explain to me that where from did he get this figure when he said there is so much black money abroad that if we bring it home, it would amount to 15 lakh rupees in the account of every Indian. Now that statement was misinterpreted it's still misinterpreted by saying that Prime Minister said, if we are elected, we will bring 15 lakhs. But that apart, where did that figure come from?
This figure...
By the way, I just want to tell our viewers and readers that there is a detailed chapter in here, how to account for the amount of black money that is there, and there are figures that range from, I think, 4 lakh crores to almost $80 billion that you have various studies. So, but particularly Prime Minister's example that he took.
You see, the Prime Minister's example, many of these figures come from the same source, except they are the same source but for different years. And the main source for all of this is the Global Financial Integrity, the GFI.
Yeah, that's right.
Which has a more current figure. The figure that the Prime Minister quoted is from an earlier figure from GFI, which had been used also for, if I recall correctly, the 2009 manifesto of the BJP party. But the critical issue there is the use of the word if.
Yes.
The reason I'm stressing that is that what people tend to forget is GFI estimates gross outflow from India,
which it says is $510 billion.
Yes, but it is gross. People do not notice that it is gross and not net.
Right.
The presumption is that if it is gross, it's still sitting there abroad. It isn't necessarily. It may very well have been brought back via the double tax avoidance kind of agreements which have been renegotiated and redone. So I personally do not think that gross figure is sitting there. There is some amount that is sitting there, but that entire gross figure is not a net figure.
Right. But so it's been 3.5 years since the government formed. How much of black money, I mean, so he gave a figure which was 15 lakhs into every account. Surely I expect him to give a figure as to how much of black money he has brought back.
You will, but do not look at it as a binary thing, that today this much, tomorrow that much, because this is a process. And the reason I'm flagging the process is, look, black has to be defined again with respect to a piece of legislation. It can be black either because there has been tax evasion, or alternatively it can be black because the activity that led to the generation of that income was illegal in the first place. It could be crime, drugs, trafficking, arms smuggling, that kind of thing. But in either case there is law, there's a legal process, and in this country, thankfully, we have a democracy, which also means we have a judicial process. Before 8th of November, there was the first income declaration scheme, which was almost a threat. under that first income declaration scheme, what 65,000,
About
almost 70,000
yeah.
crores. Now, all that is income being declared. Some of that will be revenue to the government because of taxes as well as penalties. About 400 Benami properties have been seized, out of which 240 odd are property in the sense that we understand them, that is, they are buildings, etc. Because property under the Benami property legislation is also includes movable property. All of them will go through a process. The money that has come to the system has not been legitimized in any fashion. Just because it's been brought into the banking system does not mean that it has become white, because I will now have to explain the sources of that. So over a period of time, there will be figures after the judicial process has been gone through, how much of Anand's black has emerged, how much of his black has emerged, how much of my black has emerged. But it takes time.
Yeah. In fact, I have reserved a section on demonetization, this thing. But before I come to that, there is another question which I particularly wanted to ask. Kishore, you would have seen, working in the private sector, a lot of things that happen under the table. And I suppose we talk about it, but not much of it is documented. But when you say, I'm not taking your particular example, I'm just saying that it's almost a given that when a private company is in talks with a government organization, there is underhand dealing. So as someone who has worked in there, without spilling the beans, I don't want you to, or you're most welcome to. The point is, how do you stop the corruption that happens at that is the first stage where you have a private company interacting with a government company? How do you stop that? Professor Debroy is saying that if I'm correct, you can't stop it. As far as big ticket corruption is concerned, you really can't.
No. I did not say you can't stop it.
It will never end, you say.
I said it will never completely disappear. Yeah. And much of the stuff that goes on in the US under the euphemism of lobbying is what we would call corruption.
Yeah.
So it will never completely disappear, but it is possible to reduce it. A large part of it, I think, is also linked to the issue of the way we conduct elections.
Yeah, yes. But are you for lobbying? I mean, would you...
See, so whatever I have experienced in my professional career, couple of things that I have noticed very clearly. Most of the private companies, at least the ones that I have worked for, they were MNCs and they had presence across several countries in the globe. So they used to have a very strict, I would say, code of ethics in that sense. So, the risk that these companies faced was because they have a global presence. Any allegation, even if it's just an allegation in the form of a speculation, will be so powerful that it will tank their global stock prices, and it will literally, it's not worth taking risk even for a tender, howsoever large or small it may be. So I think that ways they are very clear. In any case, Indian revenues for most of these MNC companies were big, but they were not,
to make
to even think of taking that risk. So I think that perspective was always there in these MNCs. But having said that, what is the basic source of corruption? You see, these companies actually want to win certain tenders. So it could be in the form of supply of goods or services or whatever. So that's where, as Dr. Debroy was saying, there will be some amount of discretion and there will be some amount of subjectivity, because you cannot write everything in black and white. And there will be some kind of subjectivity involved during the evaluation of tender, during the decision processes. Because there will be some kind of subjectivity, there will be elements of ethics and morality involved in that. I think one way the government has tried to minimize that is involving more stakeholders in the decision making process. So not one person at the end of the day decides. There are many people who are part of the decision making process. So if there are certain individuals who want to take that chance, they will also have that kind of a fear. You cannot expect 20 member people. I think there is a hierarchy also when you take decision, even in government. So there will be a tender evaluation committee, then there will be a committee which is senior to that, then it goes up to the minister level. So that kind of a mechanism is strong enough. I won't say it's foolproof, but it is strong enough to dissuade people who want to indulge in such kind of corrupt activities.
Right. I mean, the reason why I asked this, and I come back to ask you this question, is now recently media has been talking about the Paradise Papers. Before that was the Panama Papers. What is your view on, first of all, do you think it's very serious that a lot of Indians have been named in this, or do you think, I mean, the story has actually kind of died, if you notice, in the last 1 month, particularly because I think the investigative journalists themselves said, had a few riders as to the names that came up. But how do you view these tax havens?
Just before that, there's some quick comments I want to make. The first is that, again, we come back to the same citizen issue, but this is a point I want to make, is that as a citizen, I expect the government to clean up corruption. But when I jump a traffic light, my inclination is not to pay the penalty, but to bribe the cop. A system does not change if I continue to do that. A government is a small part of the broader society. So until the broader society changes, this is...
May I slightly disagree with you in the sense that it is human proclivity to violate a rule. So all of us would want to, violate the traffic light or the speed limit or whatever. But it's not the same, because it is up to the traffic policeman to catch us. So we might be, wanting to violate the rule, but if the traffic cop is honest, then he would stop us. And if he fines us heavily, next time we'd think twice.
But let's not quibble on this minor point, but all I'm saying is that the traffic cop is also not an angel who's descended from heaven. The traffic cop is also representative of the society that we belong in. The second point I would like to make is on the broader judicial system, and I'm linking it to something that Kishore said. The intent of our judicial system is always to punish Kishore for a crime he has committed. But that's not what the judicial system is supposed to do. The judicial system is not only supposed to punish Kishore for the crime he has committed, but to have such a large punitive element that it acts as a deterrent for a future Kishore.
That never happens.
And our judicial system does not have that punitive element. Now, so far as Panama and Paradise are concerned, I know you are a part-time journalist of sorts, so am I a part-time journalist of sorts, and journalists are apt to sensationalize and trivialize matters. To me, it is not very obvious that the individuals named have been guilty of a crime. So the question of conviction, prosecution and conviction only arises if a crime has actually been committed.
Misdemeanors, would you say? Okay, not crime,
but what is misdemeanor? It has to be something that is legal. It has to be some law that I have fallen foul of. If there is a tax haven and I have put my money there, unless there is something that I have fallen foul of, be it the income tax laws of the country or be it the foreign exchange laws of the country, I have not been guilty of anything in particular. So
moral obligation towards...
No, but I don't think it's a question of morality at all. And I'm going to say something that sounds completely scandalous, but I will say it in a minute.
That's excellent.
I will say that. I will say it in a minute. I think the finance minister said on both of these, Panama and Paradise, these were being examined, and I don't think you can have a blanket statement, because each case will certainly have to be investigated item by item to see whether there's been any violation of the law. Now, where I'm going to say something that sounds scandalizing is on the morality issue. I do not think corruption is a moral issue at all. It's fundamentally an economic issue. Now, why am I saying this? If you had a sum of money, you'd expect a reasonable degree of return on that, X%, whatever that may be. In the present electoral system, we know that a lot of money is spent to be elected. that is money being spent. The person who is therefore elected, and there's an element of uncertainty about whether that person is elected or not, will also expect a reasonable degree of return on whatever money has been spent. Which is why I said earlier that I think the big ticket kind of corruption is intricately linked to our ability to clean up the electoral system. And I quickly want to mention, this is for the first time that a discourse on cleaning up elections, whether it's through the debate on simultaneous elections or whether it's through electoral bonds, has got into the system.
Right. But to come back to this, I'm quoting you, scandalous remark that you made. I can't let that go very easily, can I? That corruption doesn't have a moral element. Now, when you have, just to take the example of many of the names that came up in the Paradise Papers as well and in the Panama one, when you have business people who are making money, who are not in any way involved in my day-to-day life or the running of my day-to-day life, I suppose you can get away by saying that corruption does not have a moral angle. But many of the people that were named in there are ministers, are either elected by us directly through Lok Sabha or nominated, get into Rajya Sabha, and then they decide our fate. Now when those people are putting their money in tax havens and things of that sort, yes, they have probably not committed any illegality, but shouldn't the moral element come in then?
No, I think the response would be, then please correct the law. Because until, you see, morality is a very dangerous thing because it tends to be very relative and tends to be very, very subjective.
I give you that.
Which is why, if I've got a problem with the tax havens, I need to look at the law that we have. Yeah. Sure, tax havens outside, but I need to look at the laws that we have, either, as I said, on the foreign exchange side or on the income tax side, and tighten those up.
Yeah. But then, to tie up with the follow-up thing, which is, what is your view on, and again, this is again one of those borderline questions on morality and on shell companies, forming shell companies?
No, shell companies are clearly violative of the law. And the shell companies in India have got away with things that they would have been crucified if they had done abroad.
But you see so many ministers
but also please grant the government this, that this is for the first time that action has been taken on the shell companies. And despite several of these shell companies lobbying, several of them have been sort of declared illegal. Their directors have been penalized.
This is that 2 lakh company too?
Yes.
Okay, right. So that brings us swiftly on to the subject of demonetization. I have been against the whole thing of demonetization, but because I'm not an economist, it is from a social angle. So be that as it may, I want to restrict myself to the economic aspect of it because I see a lot of divisions that happen between economists who were for demonetization and economists who were against demonetization. As far as the black money is concerned, one of the primary goals was that demonetization would tackle black money. So there are 2 questions that immediately arise, Professor. And the first one is, how on earth will it tackle black money when within a year or 2 years, and it's probably already started happening, you have a denomination which is higher than what was demonetized, which is 2,000 rupee notes. People would simply stack up black money again. So that's the first question. And the second one is the increasing digitization that also became one of the reasons why demonetization happened. And here I would like to just very recent, last 2 weeks ago, you had the data from the National Payments Corporation of India, NPCI, and the Reserve Bank of India. And it says that in November 2016, just before demonetization, you had 94 lakh crores total value of electronic transactions. It went up to 149.6 lakh crores in March of 2017. It has come back to 99.2 lakh crores right now, which is of October 29th. So you have the total volume of electronic transactions coming down. You have this thing of a currency which is twice the value of the currency that was demonetized. To a layman, please explain to me how demonetization that was meant to tackle black money is doing with this data around.
So let's take
First
that
and
in
two.
bits
Sure.
and pieces,
Yeah.
because you've bundled
I'm sure,
all
yes.
kinds of questions into
Right,
the same,
right. Yeah.
seemingly one question. So if I forget bits,
Yeah,
just
I'll remind you.
just
Sure.
remind me.
Yes.
Firstly, demonetization, by which I mean what happened on the 8th of November, was not meant to address the creation of new black.
Right.
There are other instruments for that, some of those we have talked about. Nor was it meant to address the stock of black that existed in the form of non-cash instruments. Again, other instruments for that, including Benami, RERA, whatever. So here was a stock of cash, some of which was black. We don't know how much was black, but some was black. Issue of cash is not something that is supposed to disappear overnight. It never can. Certainly not in a country like India, where there is a sizable element of informal and unorganized economy still. But the point that was being made is that the use of cash in India is excessive. It is excessive not only in comparison with the developed countries, it is excessive even in comparison with countries in South Asia, similar countries, Bangladesh, even Pakistan, Sri Lanka. This amount of cash is unnecessary. Not that that cash is necessarily black. Cash is not the same as black, but that cash is inefficient because it does not yield a rate of return to the holder, nor does it do the role that money has in multiply effects in fueling the economic transaction. So it's good that it comes into the banking system.
Yeah.
So the fact that almost all of the high denomination has come into the system is good. As I said earlier, this does not mean it is not subject to scrutiny. It will be subject to scrutiny. The second question that you raised about the 2000 rupee note.
Yeah.
The 2000 rupee note was introduced because of the urgency, because you are withdrawing cash and you needed to put notes back into the system. Imagine the amount of time that would have taken to print 1000 rupee notes. Imagine the efforts that would have been involved purely from a logistics point of view to convey those notes to far-flung parts of the country. It's a separate matter that over a period of time, denominations of currencies increase just to keep pace with inflation.
Sorry to interrupt, which means me to deviously suggest that if the 2000 rupee note was a stopgap arrangement, it might be removed from the system.
Not necessarily, because I also
there have been calls. There are many people.
I also brought in the question of inflation and higher denomination. Let's also accept this. This is not something that happened on the 8th of November. Discussion about this has been going on for a very long time, which is that plastic notes are superior in terms of the longer term gains. And this discussion has been going on for a long time that we should replace everything with plastic notes, plastic currency. Now it's perfectly possible that the present, I'm not privy to any information, but it's perfectly possible that the present 2000 rupee note might be replaced with a plastic note or with an alternative note that has better security features. That's perfectly possible. So don't get fixated on the denomination.
Right.
In all probability, I would argue, if I just looked at the nominal rates, nominal inflation, I'd probably argue that at some point we probably need a 5000 rupee note also. Maybe yes, maybe no.
But the CEO of Niti Aayog, Mr. Kant, I think recently mentioned that in 20 to 30 years from now, or 20 years, I don't know how much, that they said we would do away with all money completely, even the ATMs, even the debit cards. And
no, I'm not going to comment on what the CEO of Niti Aayog said. But let me link it with the question that you mentioned about
let's
the
go back to
the digital
right.
part. About the digital part also, it's an incremental process. It does not happen overnight. I am very skeptical, and so should you be, about the monthly figures, because the monthly figures go up and down, up and down. if you smoothen them out, there is no denying that there has been an upward trend in digital usage. That does not mean that cash is going to disappear from the system, because it's part of a process. It happens over a period of time. So cash is not going to become zero. But what one intends, particularly with smartphones and with Jan Dhan accounts and all of that, is an increased transition towards less use of cash because it is inefficient. Before 8th of November, it is very odd that many poor people who had bank accounts did not know that the little piece of plastic that they had was not only for withdrawing money from banks, but that it could be used for other purposes. Now, so far as ATMs are concerned, I have a slightly different take, not a different take from what the CEO of Niti Aayog said, but a slightly different point to make, which is there is an issue about the commercial viability of ATMs as we know them today. But that's a decision for banks to take, because what with these handheld devices, which are called unfortunately micro ATMs because they're nothing of the kind, and with digital transactions, it's perfectly possible that the old ATMs as we know them may no longer be viable for banks. I don't know. I would not like to outguess the advent of technology and markets, because whenever anyone tries to outguess what the market and technology is going to do 20 years down the line, one is invariably wrong.
But so when you talk about, and there is no doubt that there is an upward trend in the digitization, the question, the crux of the question is, was demonetization necessary to nudge that trend or to increase it, because that would have happened anyway? So that's the whole point. And in fact, Raghuram Rajan also mentioned that the digitization increase is a blip. He did talk about the trend, but he talked about that after.
Let me react to it in this following way. That any economist who's asked to look at something like demonetization, whether it is now or whether when it was last contemplated in the late 70s, would tend to judge it only from the narrow lens of economics, the cost benefit, and to deduce that this is not worth it. The economic benefits are not commensurate with the costs, with the economic costs. But I don't think that is the right way to look at what was done on the 8th of November. This was never intended to be a narrow economics calculation. It was meant to be, I don't know what adjective to use, it was meant to be a broader shock to institutionally cleanse it. And it was meant to be a deterrent. I myself objected to the use of the word moral, but it was meant to be a moral deterrent. And I think the fact that all of the money has come back into the system is reflective of the fact that people have perceived this deterrent as a serious deterrent. Otherwise, people would have sat on to the cash. The fact that there was a splurge in visits abroad by Indians, where the average spend went up from some $45 foreign travel, $45 billion a month, 45 billion? Yeah, something like that.
I think it was 200 something million.
45 million, it shot up.
45 to 450. Yeah.
This is all reflective of the fact that this is now perceived to be a serious deterrent. So Benami, RERA, all of these, and 8th of November fits into this, that this is a serious threat. I will say the following: if people had listened carefully to the PM's Mann Ki Baat, that implied threat was there.
Before, you're talking about before 8th November?
Before 8th of November. It was very much there. He had said that this is the last, the income declaration scheme, this is the last chance you have got. People did not take it very seriously, and obviously could not have announced that there is going to be...
But do you think demonetization could come back after a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years?
No.
I mean, do you think it's an instrument that should be used regularly?
No, but what makes you think that there cannot be other instruments? Because I think, again, if you listen to Mann Ki Baat, the intention is very clear that, and including his speeches in Gujarat, that this thing of cleansing up the system is going to stay.
Wouldn't you also agree, I mean, just a couple of last questions, I think we've horribly run out of time. There is a huge element of hypocrisy in what the Prime Minister says a lot, because yes, he is personally, there is no blot of corruption on him. There is very little corruption that a common man can see that this government has done in the last 3 years. Let's be honest about it. But, and you have devoted a lot of time in your book about the election and how that election is the seed for corruption. I put it to you that BJP is no different from any other party when it comes to tackling corruption and when it comes to winning an election. How has the Prime Minister, by repeatedly saying that I am, and he's used pretty strong language as well. I mean, I think on the eve of or just after demonetization, he said, "Ye mujhe jala denge." A lot of emotional vigor was into that thing. It just seems a trifle hypocritical of the Prime Minister to keep on. The blurb, for example, is corruption and black money have destroyed Indian democracy, eating into it like a termite. BJP is equally responsible.
No. You see, look, Anand, these are blanket statements which I will not react to because I am not completely aware of what the BJP has done as a political party. But to the best of my understanding, and I may be wrong, the BJP is one of the first parties which had insisted on payments not to be made in cash. I think something like that. Remember, we are talking about a system which has built up over 7 decades. It takes time to cleanse it. I'm not speaking on behalf of the BJP, but I also am inclined to think that the BJP is probably a bit more careful about choosing candidates than many other political parties. But I will leave it at that because I do not want to stick my neck out on something that I don't know at all about. I'm not ducking the question.
Okay, just one final question because time is really moved on, and I can't let you leave without talking about your very good friend Dr. Subramaniam Swamy and his theory, which I think he keeps on reiterating. Of course, last month when there was this economic doom, he gave an interview, I think, to V. Shangvi, where he said it's almost about to collapse, the Indian economy, and that was before the ease of business rankings or the good news from exports and things of that sort. But during that interview, he said that I would remove income tax completely, and the reason I would do this is because it would tackle the black money, and B, all that money would give a huge impetus to spending, public spending, people spending, and that would give a lift to the economy. So as an economist and as a great friend of Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, how do you react to this for a short-term goal to remove income tax altogether?
Let me step back a bit from that and look at it from the tax policy point of view. Because this is essentially a debate about direct taxes vis-a-vis indirect taxes.
Correct.
That's what it really is, because income tax does not just mean personal income tax, it also means corporate tax. Although he says that in the context of personal income tax, if you are removing one, you'll have to remove the other also, because one masquerades as the other. Direct taxes can be progressive. Indirect taxes, even if I attempt to segregate according to the item, which makes it very complicated, are inherently not progressive, and therefore disproportionately they make the relatively poor suffer, because the poor pay higher taxes. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
In a country like India, given the present basis, the equivalent amount that I would have to impose on the indirect tax system to compensate for the elimination of that, because roughly speaking it's half and half. So roughly speaking, let's take any item. Whatever be the item, you'd have to pay double the tax just to compensate for that removal. So I think on two strong grounds, I don't think it's a very sensible proposition.
As far as the black money is concerned, the aspect of black money, if you remove income tax altogether.
No, because there is a lot of corruption and black associated with the indirect tax system also. Why do you think people are screaming about GST? Part of that screaming about GST is because now you're part of the tax threshold. Earlier you were outside the system, you could get away with the kacha receipts. So it's not quite the case that there is corruption only with the direct tax system and not with the indirect. The indirect tax system also has plenty of corruption.
Right. And was absolute last question, which was a subset of this question. Our tax to GDP ratio is, would you say, abysmally low, or is improving, or where would you like to see it in the next 4 or 5 years?
The tax to GDP
I think
ratio,
America's is 54%, ours is...
you must be careful with the international comparisons, because if you look at the international comparisons, what they look at is only the union government part of taxation. So you'll find figures like 10%
Federal,
of
yes,
GDP.
that's right.
That's incorrect, because you should look at the state level also, and you should look at the local body taxes also, which we don't have figures on. So the union plus state today is about 17% of GDP, and it's been more or less flat at that 17% of GDP for a very, very long time. What I quickly want to mention is that about more than 5% of GDP is tax that we give up today because of exemptions. So if we did not have those exemptions, the tax GDP ratio would be about 22%. If I look at comparable countries, the tax GDP ratio is around, depending on the country, because if it is one of the Scandinavian or Western European countries, it might be as high as 40%. Depends also on how you count tax, because there are social security contributions which sometimes in other countries are under the garb of tax. But I would say that it should be about 25% of GDP.
Okay. And you would like it to rise?
I would like it to rise to about 25%, because after all, the government needs the money to do several things which are public goods, which it has to do, whether it is the national highways, whether it is the defense, whether it is the railways, and you therefore need resources. Some of those resources come from growth, but some of them come from broadening the base and perhaps even reducing rates. But the broadening the base requires the removal of exemptions.
Right. Just final couple of minutes, because your admirers on social media I had asked them to ask you
all
questions.
of them are not admirers.
Even trolls are admirers. Okay, so just a couple of questions I must take from them, which was, yes, so this is from Ramnath. And he asks you, the government wants to promote digital cash to curb black money some people stash, but our power and telecom line, they are anything but fine. So tell me, sir, isn't this war on cash a bit too rash? So, and there is another one that is also basically talking the same thing, when our phone connection system is actually not up to the mark.
No, but you see, let me separate the power from the telecom, because the power to a large extent is still government driven. Telecom is a slightly different proposition. Now, for the power sector, we don't have time to cite figures, but the electrification has proceeded quite well. There is a problem with the transmission, but so far as the distribution is concerned, in parts where the numbers are quite impressive. Then people begin to criticize, saying that what about the quality of electricity? But that's a secondary debate. It's an important debate. Let's at least accept that now I have electrification. There are probably just about 3,000 odd villages that don't have electrification, and there are numbers now on the households also. Telecom also, the debate is more often than not now about quality. Telecom also, the penetration has been pretty good. So I think we should recognize that I am not suggesting for a minute that it has become perfect and manna has descended from heaven, but certainly incrementally on both of these there have been improvements.
Right. This one is from Murlidhar Koteshwar, and he says, why is the government shy of catching the big fish in the fry, while making the common man cry and letting the crooks escape and fly. I suppose the reference is to Vijay Mallya and one Chidambaram Esquire, who's been tweeting merrily, reach safely when he lands in London.
No, I think there are three things I want to say. Firstly, it's linked to something I said earlier. By the way, I don't like the expression common man. I don't know what it means other than R.K. Lakshman cartoons. I have no idea what it means.
Or Arvind Kejriwal.
Or Arvind Kejriwal, because the people who pretend to be common man are anything but that. They are the urban, pampered middle class. But having said that, I think a lot of people sometimes fail to distinguish between the assets and the liabilities of a company and the individual assets and liabilities of the promoter. It's a very important distinction, but it is a distinction and it's applicable to Vijay Mallya also. The second issue is there is a judicial process, and one cannot suddenly throw away the judicial process. Three, the so-called big fish have been sent notices. They have a lot of explanation to do, and obviously, as I said, we can't throw away the judicial process.
Right. On that lovely note, it leaves me to thank Professor Debroy.
Thank you.
Kishore for
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So, viewers, subscribe to News Laundry. Remember, when the public pays, the public is served. When corporations pay, corporations are served. Thanks very much.